Today I am joined with Amy Cashman, who is one of our teachers at both Brighton and Mordialloc.
Hi.
Welcome, Ames. And today we are talking about intentional creative sequencing. Mm-hmm. Epic topic, really designed for yoga teachers specifically, or if you're in training or you're thinking about training, this might be a really great episode for you. So Ames, before we jump into the topic, let's talk about you as a teacher, how long you've been teaching for, we'd love to know, and also your style of teaching.
Awesome. Well, I have been teaching yoga now for 7 years. Before that, I taught Pilates and fitness, but then yoga was my natural transition and my big love. So yeah, it's been coming up to 7 years next year. My teaching style, I love my classes to be really playful, really creative and really intentional. I love to encourage my students to move from a really intuitive place. So it's an opportunity to really draw inward, to get to know themselves a little bit better, and also notice how they show up in moments of challenge and how they meet themselves when they're challenged.
Yes, if you haven't been to Amy's class, you need to go. It is honestly, packs a punch, I say. You're going to do all kinds of movements. It's so creative. You never know where you're going to go, which I love classes like that, because you can really lose yourself in the practice 100%. And you can be just, it's not where you expect it to go, which I love.
No.
And you're really good at also creating mindful moments and pause. So at the end of the class, it feels really balanced, really intentional, which is what we're talking about today.
100%. Yeah. Exactly.
So let's start by talking about the why behind intentional sequencing.
It's a good question, right? Why do we want to sequence with intention? Why do we want to sequence with purpose? Essentially, if we look back at the definition of vinyasa, it means to place in a special way. And so when we look at that, we can see immediately that the postures need to have a really thoughtful order. We need to put a little bit of effort and thought into how we position each pose, in what order we do it, and also what the transitions will be like as well. Because we know that, the transitions, the moments in between are just as important as the postures themselves.
I love that.
Yeah.
And who do you think we are, teaching to? Because at the studio, we get such a wide range of ages and bodies and abilities.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we look at who's coming through the door. A lot of the times it's people who work a lot, right? They work office jobs or they drive a lot. Or we've got parents who are holding babies, carrying babies, feeding babies or children, lots of babies. But essentially we're seeing people who are kind of coming in like this, right? Yeah.
I just rounded my shoulders back.
They've got, weak and tight hip flexors. They've got a weak core. They've got rounded shoulders, tight chest, tight hips. It's a lot of this kind of positioning, which is just a result of modern living, unfortunately. So it adds another layer of our teaching. We're looking at not just sequencing for whatever the complex pose, a peak pose is that we're leading our students towards, but we're also looking to help to return them back to more of an anatomical neutral position. So shoulders back and lengthened and strong and all those sorts of good things.
Yeah, for sure. So let's dive straight into the principles and guidelines of creative sequencing, or intelligent sequencing as well.
Well, that's it. I think essentially what we're looking at doing is guiding our students through a really thoughtful experience, right? We're looking to create a container for their experience and for their own personal practice, because although we're moving as a collective, everyone comes to have that inward experience. At the heart of any vinyasa class, I believe, is the bell curve. And if you've done your 200-hour teacher training, especially if you've done it with Warrior One, you will know that the bell curve is of utmost importance. And the reason being is it means that we move our students from the grounding, right? We start closer to the ground. We begin to warm slowly and gently. We reach a fiery peak, which might be super fiery. It might be not quite so fiery, but there'll always be a point that's just a little bit more complex or challenging, than the grounding or the shavasana. And then we want to take that time to then cool down as well. So I think by looking at that gentle bell curve, we can help to create our sequences in a way that's going to feel a little better in the body, so that we're not jumping from a super complex hard shape straight away, something that the body isn't quite prepared for.
I love that.
Yeah. So that would be step number one. Always look back to the bell curve. When looking at the bell curve, I think it's also really interesting to make sure that we're looking at the energetics of it as well. So we're peppering in our elements. So in the beginning, when we're down closer to the earth and we're grounding our students, obviously that's got that earth energy, right? That grounding energy. As we start to build a little bit of movement, and as we begin to move with breath, which we do a lot of the time in our vinyasa, cat-cow, rolling bridge, rolling plank, sun salutations, we begin to add in the element of water, and that begins to warm the body. Then once we reach that peak, fire, right? That's when we get the heat of it, and that's the juice, I think. And then we come back down, and this is where the space happens. Often when we're entering the cool down period and we're cooling our students, it's where we add those little thematic mic drop moments, right? We've got them in pigeon pose and we hit them with the good stuff. Or we say nothing, right? And we give them that space to really feel what's going on. And then we return back to the earth and that grounding element. I like to add in as well, air. So air, as we move the whole way through, is breath. But it's also the personality that you bring to your classes. It's the lightness and the laughter and the way that you hold your students. So adding in the elements to your bell curves is another essential step, I think.
I'm just loving listening to you, so excited about this, particularly when it got to the fiery part.
Yeah, I know. I love purposeful sequencing so much, because I do believe that a lot of our students come to the practice for the physical, right? I know for me, when I started yoga, I was like, I want to do handstands. I want to get really strong. I want to get really flexible and do the splits and all those sorts of things. And then before you know it, you're like, oh gosh, like the mindfulness hits and the meditative stuff hits, and then the philosophy creeps in and all these wonderful things that your teachers weave in to their classes without you even realizing, right? And we can do that through sequencing, through speaking to the physical, through making people feel really powerful, really good, and creating things in an intentional way. So speaking of which, once we've moved from the bell curve, we've moved to the elements, we look at our sequence in general, or we look at what we want to create with our sequence. And whether we're teaching beginners or whether we're teaching regular practitioners, there's always going to be a shape or a posture, or even it could be a transition that is more complex, more challenging than anything else. In order to give our students the best experience to be able to play with this shape or transition to the best of their ability and safely, we look at what's happening in the body in that shape in order to break it down and really prepare and warm them in a thoughtful way. So we look at the joint action, what's happening in the joints of the body. We look at what's strengthening and what's lengthening. And also it's a good idea to look at what's vulnerable. So what we need to keep an eye on, essentially. So once we've got our peak pose, say it's half moon. I'm teaching to a moderate mixed level class, and I'm going to teach a half moon class. When we look at the body, we can see that the standing leg is an external rotation and it's extended. So we're going to need to prep the hip. We're also going to need to lengthen that internal or the inside hamstring. And then the back leg is going to need to be fired up as well, right? Another thing to think about is we're going to prep balance too, because standing on one leg is pretty hard for many people. So it's nice to add in little balance challenges before we get to that big shape, essentially.
Yes.
So I've got my peak pose, half moon. I then look at what's happening. We've got the external rotation and the lengthening of the standing leg, the activation of the back leg. I look at where I can see that in less complex shapes. The first one that comes to my mind, supported side plank, right? It's very similar, but the bottom knee is down and it's bent. So we're immediately taking out a little bit of a challenge because we're closer to the ground. So essentially you're looking at all these different ways that you can break down a similar shape or ways to make that similar shape in the body. And it doesn't need to be all in one go. You can work just with the leg, whatever it may be. Say it's crow pose, you can work just on protraction. Say it's dancer's pose, you can work just on the external rotation of the shoulder. You can break it down to its simplest components and then thread those into your sequence so that by the time you get to that firing peak of the class, your students are like, oh, I feel really ready for this. This is the best I've ever felt attempting this posture, which essentially is your goal at the end of the day. And yeah, you just want to make sure that you're really being thoughtful about what postures you're putting in.
Mm-hmm. And what about modifications? You know, we talk a lot about mixed level classes, often at Warrior One. You know, you've got somebody maybe that's their first time, you've maybe got a pregnant person, and then maybe an advanced practitioner.
Definitely, yeah. So you always need to make sure that you can upscale and downscale your shapes. Again, there's always going to be a more complex and a less complex version. If we look at, say, half Hanuman, for example, this is probably, in terms of that sort of release, that hamstring release in that shape, is the least complex version of that. We then take a little step up and we're in pyramid pose. The back knee is lifted. We've got activation of the back leg. We're a little higher from the ground. We then want to add a little more challenge and we're in standing split. So we're adding the element of balance as well to that shape. So when you look at any poses throughout your sequence that you feel like might pose a little bit of a challenge, if you've got someone in your class that you're keeping an eye out for, which you should always be, make sure you have these downscaled versions of the shape in your back pocket. So when you get to those points in the practice, you're like, you can stay here. You can say, this is a beautiful place to be, or come with me and try this, or come with me and try this. So it's what we call the bus stop option, right? You're giving people lots of places where they can stop off at. So no one feels like they're not doing anything. No one feels like they're failing. Everyone feels like they're still in the practice. They're still doing a similar shape. And then people still feel challenged. You know, if they want to take it that big step further and go for it, they can.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Any other guidelines you wanted to mention?
I would say the other really important thing to think about is, say we've done all of our prep for our fiery peak pose. Say our peak pose this time is crow pose. So we've done lots of protraction for the shoulders. We've done lots of compression work for the hip flexors. We've done lots of core work, heels hugging in, all this wonderful stuff. And then gets to the end of the practice and it's going to feel pretty amazing to release all of that, right? So when we look at what we've done all this pressing action, and opening through the chest is going to feel real juicy. A supported bridge or a wheel is going to feel really nice to open all that place that all the places that we've compressed and that we've strengthened. So when you are creating your class and you're doing all these wonderful things, you're adding in all those similar poses to get them to their peak, think about on the other side of that, what's going to feel really beautiful to then release all of that good stuff.
Yeah, so there's an active and a passive option within your sequencing.
Definitely.
Yeah, I feel that. Any other last minute guidelines that really make an intelligent sequence, an intentional sequence?
I guess at the end of the day, more than anything, you need to make sure that you are practicing what you're putting together. So on paper, we can write down a sequence, we can make it look, you know, we've done all the right things. We've strengthened, we've lengthened, we've kept in mind what's vulnerable, we've looked at the joint action. But if you move through the sequence and it doesn't quite feel right or it doesn't quite make sense, then it probably needs to be tweaked. And I don't think we can ever really know until we actually move through it ourselves. I have done many things that I'm like, oh, that's great. You know, that's going to work perfectly. And then you do it and you're like, that just feels real weird. I don't think that's going to work. Or you're just being too creative, right? Creativity for the sake of being creative. Essentially, creativity is our tool. We want to make sure that really we're moving from an intentional anatomical place using creativity to either help solve a sequencing problem, you know, or help to find a more playful practice, all that sort of thing.
Yes, I do think there's such a thing as too creative, right? And people do get confused and it becomes overwhelming for the practitioner.
Definitely. So I think I've done that for sure. I'm guilty. But one thing that I did learn was that those moments of creativity are really awesome because they provide often a source of laughter. Like, people are like, what are we doing? Where are we going? But in between, there needs to be moments of familiarity. So chuck in your triangles, trikonasana, chuck in your side angles, because then people are like, okay, no, we're here. We know where we're going. Or moments of pit. I love a wide-legged forward fold pit stop. I love to hammer, pose, wide-legged forward fold. Take a moment, reset, draw back inward, and then we hit it again.
If you haven't picked it up in this podcast, Amy does love to just work people to their max.
I'm very nice. I'm very kind. That's another really
in
good
a loving way.
Well, that's another really good point, you know, is that when we are moving through these styles of sequences, it can be really confronting for people. It can be challenging if the sequence that you're doing is fiery, if it's towards quite a complex peak pose. So I do think the way that you speak to your students really matters as well. Holding from this place of love and support and encouragement. Make sure you're always watching them. You know, I don't love using people's names because I had this teacher once and he would just say good work to everyone. And for me, it felt like he was just talking to me. So I really love that. So often I will just try and speak to the whole group, but I watch everyone. I watch what everyone's doing, and I'm genuinely so excited when I see people in their flow, giving things a go. So as much as we are, you know, building fire, working up to that peak, we're also supporting and really holding from this place of love.
For sure. And look, to be completely honest, I actually love challenging classes and, you know, owning a studio for almost 9 years. What I do know is communities actually need to grow. Mm-hmm. The growth element, we talked about this at the beginning of the podcast, it has to be there, because if you're not learning and, you know, doing challenging poses like crow or half moon or full splits or whatever it is, if you're not progressing, then you may lose interest in the practice.
Well, it's really encouraging to see yourself make these like physical progressions. Yeah. But then also, even in those moments of challenge, like I spoke about before, like noticing how you show up when you are challenged. Are you criticizing yourself? Are you judging yourself? Or are you having a laugh and like holding yourself from this place of understanding and compassion, rather than focusing on the physical aspect, which is super fun to finally nail that arm balance you've been working on, but also like how lovely to be super supportive to yourself and have this really lovely moment of practice where you're not judging, you're not criticizing, you're just love.
Being.
Right?
Yeah.
Being, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And how do you personally stay inspired and come up with your sequences?
Well, as you know, I'm a mother now and a mum. So prior to that, I just loved practicing. I loved practicing other teachers' classes. I'm constantly inspired. We've got such an amazing community of yoga teachers in Melbourne, so I feel like we're really spoiled.
Super lucky.
So number one is get out to other teachers' classes, have a chat to them about it. I feel like most teachers are really into sequencing, so it's really fun to nerd out and have a chat about these sorts of things. The other thing, well, since I am a mother, I'm at home a lot of the time now. I don't have as much time to get out as I did before, but luckily we have an amazing resource on the internet. We have got the Warrior One platform with some epic classes, but there's heaps everywhere, like no matter what your style is.
So many
And that's
platforms.
the coolest thing, right? Is that although, you know, we've got this epic community in Melbourne, like what are they doing over in Seattle? You know, what are they doing in London? You can get super inspired by what yoga teachers are doing all over the world, which is awesome.
Yes. So thank you so much, Ames. It's been so nice to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Before we finish, is there any other last things you want to say to teachers?
Have fun with your sequencing. Honestly, I feel like it's the primary form of communication with your students. So teach them with intention, teach them with purpose, teach them with love, and have fun with it.
That's what it's all about. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.